One of the Boys by Troy Smith. Ray plunked the record on the turntable and said, "He has a cow's tongue, you know." "Huh?" said Todd, who was wrapped up in a Hardy Boys mystery. Ray thrust the album cover in his little brother's face, and Todd jerked his head back. The garish cover showed four guys made up like demons, and one of them did have an amazing tongue. "Gene Simmons, moron," said Ray, with a withering look of contempt for his brother's ignorance. With a wail like that of an animal being tortured to death, the music began. Ray let out a wail of his own and sat down across from Todd, who was trying to get back to the Hardy Boys. Ray flipped the book out of Todd's hands with a casual flick of his foot and said, "See, the way I heard it? He cut out his own tongue and had this cow's tongue sewn in. Look!" Todd looked. He was pretty sure the operation Ray was describing was impossible, but Ray knew everything. And besides, the guy's tongue looked too long to be human. "Isn't this new Kiss album great?" "Sure is," said Todd, and leaned over to get his book back. Todd privately thought that Kiss was putrid. He preferred Olivia Newton-John. But he would have stuffed his whole fist in his mouth before admitting it to his brother. Todd went back to reading, and Ray got up to dance in time to the howling of the stereo. Todd liked reading about Frank and Joe Hardy. He didn't know the title of the Hardy Boys book he was reading. It was an old one of Ray's with the cover torn off. But it was a good one. Frank and Joe were locked in an abandoned lighthouse with a bomb ticking away below them. Todd knew they would escape in time to catch the robbers, but he still couldn't wait to find out how. He glanced at Ray, who was playing air guitar along with his new Kiss album. Todd found it hard to believe that Ray had ever liked the Hardy Boys. As far as Todd could tell, his big brother never read anything but the old Playboys he stole from their father's closet. Todd shrugged and went back to Frank and Joe in the lighthouse. The album cut off mid-howl. Todd flicked another glance at Ray and saw him shrugging into his ski jacket. Todd closed his book and said, "Hey, Ray, where you going?" Ray stuffed his blonde hair into the stocking cap Aunt Christine had given him for Christmas. She'd given Todd one exactly like it, and said, "Over to Coker's. What's it to you?" Todd ran his tongue over his lips and swallowed. Bobby Coker was the biggest asshole among Ray's friends, and he loved to torture Todd. If he, Todd, were to show up at Coker's house with Ray, he was sure to be crying within an hour. "Can I come too?" Todd and Ray arrived at Coker's house, and Todd saw with relief that Coker would probably be too busy to torture him that day. Coker was in his garage, standing beside a pile of boards and other stuff. The garage echoed with the music blaring from the new portable radio that Coker had gotten for Christmas. It was really cool, thought Todd, sleek and slim, made out of bright red plastic. Todd tugged at his stocking cap, the one Aunt Christine had given him. He stuffed his copy of The Hobbit into the back pocket of his jeans and hurried to catch up to his brother. When Todd caught up to Ray, he was standing next to Coker, their breaths fogging the December air like they were smoking. Coker leered at Todd and did his special trick, letting a spit bubble dangle from the end of his tongue. When the bubble finally popped, the fine spray of saliva sifted through the air like mist. Todd stepped back to avoid being showered.
"Oh, man, why'd you bring your little brother, Ray?"
said Coker, and looked at Todd with frank dislike. Ray ignored Coker's comment. He took a few steps toward the garage and said, "So, what are we going to do today?" Todd stepped into the garage and took a closer look at the pile of stuff on the floor. He saw some assorted boards, a set of handlebars from an old bike, a stack of cushions from Coker's dad's speedboat, and a pair of beat-up old water skis with the fins broken off. He poked at the water skis with his toe and said, "Yeah, what are you going to do with this stuff?" Coker tugged at the tongue of his left sneaker and said,
"I was watching Wide World of Sports this morning. Had a great idea. Let's build a bobsled out of this stuff. That big hill by the tennis courts will be perfect. What do you say?"
"How are we going to steer it?" asked Ray, pulling off his stocking cap. A Bee Gees song came on the radio, and Ray turned it down with a grimace of distaste. Todd knew better than to get involved in strategy discussions, so he sat on one of the seat cushions and pulled out his copy of The Hobbit.
No problem. We'll use these.
Coker held up the handlebars and a pair of kiddie snow skis.
We'll just rig these together and install them in the front of the bobsled. Whoever's in front will steer.
Ray looked at Coker uncertainly, then shrugged and said, "Okay." Todd was fairly certain that to steer a bobsled you had to have a banked run, but long experience with Ray's friends had taught him to keep his opinions to himself. Ray found a Kiss song on the radio and cranked up the volume. He and Coker dragged the materials into the driveway and got to work. Todd found a comfortable spot and opened up The Hobbit, following Bilbo Baggins into Gollum's lair to get the magic ring and get out again alive. By the time the bobsled was nearly finished, the sun had swung past its midpoint. Todd put away his book and looked over the older boy's handiwork. He saw with growing excitement that the bobsled would seat 3. He began to hope they would let him ride it with them. He knew Coker wouldn't want him to, but he had faith that Ray would talk his friend into letting Todd go along. He looked with admiration at Ray, who at that moment was concentrating on installing the steering mechanism, the tip of his tongue sticking out between his teeth. It was about 4 blocks from Coker's house to the hill where they would launch the bobsled. The older boys carried the bobsled, one on each side. Todd thought they looked like pallbearers. They arrived at the hill and dropped their burden to the snow, puffing plumes of foggy breath into the frigid air. Coker was humming a Kiss tune, Rock and Roll Over, that had been on the radio several times while they built the bobsled. Todd found it irritating. He walked over to the edge of the hill, tugging at his stocking cap and sliding his book into his back pocket, and looked down the slope. His breath caught when he saw how steep it was. Coker suddenly stiffened and said,
"Oh!"
Todd and Ray turned and looked at him, and he said,
"I just had an awesome idea."
Ray smirked and said, "Like when you built that giant skateboard and almost got run over because you couldn't get it to turn or stop?" It occurred to Todd that there was a distinct similarity between the skateboard incident and the one they were about to do, but he didn't say anything. He just concentrated on catching snowflakes on his tongue and struggled not to laugh.
"Look, asshole, do you want to hear my idea or not?"
Coker said in a tight, controlled voice. Ray quieted down and said, "Sure, man. What's up?" Coker's eyes gleamed, and he said,
"Let's make a ramp at the bottom of this hill. You know, like a ski jump."
Ray said,
"That's a kick-ass idea, man. Let's do it."
Todd, on the other hand, was horrified. He shouted, "Are you nuts? We'll kill ourselves!" Coker pounced.
"What's the matter, baby? Are you chicken?"
He laughed so hard his tongue was sticking out. Todd took a step back and held the Hobbit in front of him like a talisman. He wished he could put on Bilbo Baggins's magic ring and disappear. He tried to say something, but Coker cut him off with a loud cry of, "Chicken! Bok, bok, bok!" Todd felt his face go all hot, and he knew that in a few more minutes, in spite of all he could do, he would begin to cry. As soon as that happened, what little standing he had with Coker would evaporate. Ray stepped in, shoved Coker back a pace, and said, "Leave my little brother alone, asshole. He didn't do anything to you." As Coker backed off and pretended to be terrified, Ray took Todd by the arm and led him off a ways. Coker brushed the falling snow from the red plastic of his radio and waited for the brothers to rejoin him. Ray regarded Todd for a moment with a look of amused half-disgust on his face and said, "You got a snot bubble in your nostril. Get a hold of yourself." He sat silent for a moment and then said, "Look, you got to straighten up if you want to hang out with my friends and me. I know you're smarter than any of us, all the books you read, but they don't. They look at you, they just see a kid. We're all 12. By next summer, we'll be teenagers. You're only 8. You want to hang out with us, you've got to try to fit in. You got to go along with what the rest of us want to do. You do want to be one of the guys, right?" Todd ran his tongue over his lips and said, "Ray, It's stupid to make a ramp out of snow. It'll never work. The bobsled'll just plow right into it," Ray said. "Then help us make a good one. Come on." He laid a hand on Todd's shoulder and guided him back to Coker, who was cursing and trying to find a radio station that wasn't playing the Bee Gees. Ray and Coker followed Todd's hesitant commands, and the ramp took shape. Ray was wearing an Army surplus helmet liner over Aunt Christine's stocking cap. The helmet was commandeered and used as a water pail. They brought water from a creek that ran along the bottom of the hill and poured it over layer after layer of snow, gradually building a strong, icy ramp. Todd found a piece of plywood, and it was incorporated to strengthen the ramp. Todd noticed Coker glowering at him several times and realized that he probably resented having his idea taken over by a little kid like Todd. It worried Todd, but he could think of nothing to do about it. They packed a last layer of dry snow on top, and the ramp was finished. It looked quite narrow to Todd, but time was running out fast. The light had taken on that blue cast that means full darkness is no more than a half-hour away. It was clear that they would have time for only one run down the hill before they had to head home. The boys struggled back up the slope to the bobsled. There was a perfectly serviceable stairway by the tennis courts, but none of them would have been so unmanly as to use it. Todd looked down at the ramp and found himself hoping that they wouldn't let him ride with them after all. He was so used to being excluded from such activities, in fact, that he had already pulled out the Hobbit and settled himself under the streetlight to read and listen to the radio. The DJ, Todd noticed with relief, had finally decided to give the Kiss song a rest, when Coker motioned him over.
"I've been thinking, kid, that it seems only right to me that you should get to sit in front and steer for the ride down."
Todd could tell that Coker was expecting him to back down, and in truth, he wanted very much to do just that. Instead, he ran his tongue over his lips, returned his book to his back pocket, and sat on the front cushion. Ray got on behind Todd and said in his ear, "You don't have to do this, Todd. He's just jerking you around." In answer, Todd jammed his stocking cap down on his head, gripped the handlebars, and waited. Coker shoved the bobsled out over the edge of the hill and jumped onto the rear cushion. With a lurch and a sinking sensation, the bobsled headed for the ramp. To Todd, it was like on Star Trek when the ship went into warp drive. First, the trees on either side of them stretched, then blurred into featurelessness. First, he heard the thrilled whoops of the other boys behind him, then just the whispery music of the water skis on the snow. A low branch snatched his stocking cap from his head. He barely felt it go. Todd saw that they were steering a bit off course and tried the steering mechanism. It failed, of course. They had been foolish to think it would work. The small skis turned at first, but the bobsled didn't turn at all. Then the two small nails with which Ray had put the steering gear together gave way, leaving Todd holding a pair of handlebars attached to nothing. They hit the ramp off-center, and the bobsled corkscrewed into the air. Todd heard Ray's scream trail away to his left as the other boys were flung off the bobsled. Todd, whose feet were tangled in the ruined steering mechanism, could do nothing but ride the bobsled to the end of its short flight. He could hear the music from Coker's radio faint in the distance as the ground spun overhead and smashed into him. Todd heard the muffled groans of the others around him and raised his face from the mushy bowl of red-stained snow in which it lay. He touched his face and his hand came away as red as Coker's radio. A surge of pain in his mouth told him he had bitten his tongue on impact. He spat a mouthful of crimson saliva onto the ground and sat up. The scene reminded him of the battle from The Hobbit. Ray and Coker sprawled behind him, both of them stirring now. Todd shook his groggy head to clear it and looked around for the bobsled. He saw with horror that although the ruined steering gear had slowed it considerably, it was inching towards the rushing creek at the edge of the clearing. Todd moaned with alarm and lurched to his feet. Unnoticed, one of his snow boots trampled his book, which had come out of his pocket in the crash. At the moment, his whole being was focused on the escaping bobsled. He lumbered after it, his sodden legs thudding forward, jolting his throbbing tongue at every step. Just when it seemed the bobsled must go over the retaining wall and into the rushing water, Todd lunged and caught it. It was a stupid thing to do, really. It weighed more than he did. For a moment, Todd was sure it would drag him into the creek after it. He dug his heels into the frozen earth and strained back with his jaw clenched, feeling the blood from his bitten tongue drooling down his chin. He and the sled stayed poised briefly, and then it slid back onto dry land. Todd turned around to face the others, tottered, and sat down hard. Above, Coker's radio played on, Olivia Newton-John's voice ringing out clearly in the distance. Ray stumbled over to his brother and said, "Geez, Todd, what happened to you? Your face is all bloody." Ray's face was filled with concern, either for his brother or for the whipping he would surely get for letting Todd get so jacked up. Todd said thickly, his tongue paining him,
"I saved it. It was going into the water, but I saved it."
After being such a hero, he knew they would finally accept him as one of them. His mind whirled with ideas for fixing the bobsled. Some kind of rudder would work better than the skis had, he thought. Maybe one on each side so it would steer like a tank. He opened his mouth to say they should get to work on it in the morning, but he was interrupted. Coker stood over him and said,
"Why'd you bother to save it? It didn't work anyway. I would have let the piece of junk go into the river."
Todd stared. With that pronouncement, Coker had dismissed Todd's effort and his own invention all at once. Coker went on,
"Besides, I thought of something better to do tomorrow. It's trash day. Everybody'll be putting their Christmas trees out."
Ray said,
"Yeah, Christmas tree forts."
The annual battle between Christmas tree forts was legendary in their neighborhood. Todd knew he didn't stand a chance against such a powerful enticement. Coker started up the hill, the great bobsled disaster already forgotten. Ray hesitated and turned back to Todd. He said,
"Todd, I was thinking, do you want to design our fort this year? I know it'll be awesome if you do it."
Todd looked at Ray for a moment and shook his head. The music snapped off in the twilight as Coker flipped the switch on his radio. Todd probed his hurt tongue and winced. It felt as big as a cow's. He said,
"Nah, your friends don't want to hang out with a little kid like me. I'm just going to stay home."
He started to climb the hill, then shrugged and headed for the stairs. On his way to the stairs, Todd realized his book and hat were missing. He found the book in the snow, swollen, like his tongue, he thought, and wet, with a footprint on the mangled pages. His cap was nowhere to be seen, but it didn't seem important to him. It was silly trying to look like Ray all the time anyway, he thought. Ray took a few steps after Todd. Trying to make a joke, he said,
"Hey, don't go messing around with my Kiss records while I'm gone, you hear?"
Todd looked over his shoulder and said,
"Don't worry, Ray. I think Kiss is putrid."
He jammed his hands into his pocket and trudged up the stairs toward home.